Hey folks, this is going to be the presentation for the Germany group. My name is Al. I work with Stephen, Tabitha, and Jen, and we focused on the vaccine distribution efforts and protests in Germany. I'm going to give a quick introduction and overview as to the project, and my friends will go more into the specifics of everything. To begin with the question of what is the context in which this conflict unfolded, the conflict in Germany regarding COVID-19 vaccine distributions and protests related to the health and safety mandates and restrictions imposed by the government occurs within a country context of Germany, obviously, but more specifically a subset of confrontational politics, which we actually read about this week in some of our class materials. This confrontational politics was fueled by this necessarily strict quarantine and vaccination measures, but it was also exacerbated by the populist movements sort of injecting their own ideologies into this general anti-structural sentiment that was already in place pre-pandemic, but it is now being used by these movements as sort of fuel on the fire. And this scenario really isn't unique to Germany. We can see it in the United States as well. But of course, it's a little more vitriolic here, and our political situation is a little more messed up. But you know this. In terms of the key lines of divisions in the community that have emerged, we focused on two things here. The first of which was the preference of German citizens to wait longer in order to be inoculated by the BioNTech and Pfizer vaccines over the seemingly less effective AstraZeneca. And this created a situation in which, combined with the subset of the population who were dragging their feet and getting vaccinated, regardless of the brand of shot anyway, it left a too large amount of population unvaccinated, and it was a cause for concern both for the spread of and also preventative measures against the virus moving forward. The second line of division occurred through sort of a communication and structural breakdown between the regional leaders and sort of the local state governments of Germany and the central government itself on when and how to lift the health and safety restrictions. There was a lot of fragmented lifting of the restrictions in certain parts of the country. People were under very strict conditions, and other parts were just completely acting like the pandemic was completely over. And this essentially caused a lot of socio-political and socioeconomic strife across the country. But also, going back, it was another thing that was used by these populist movements and far-right groups to sort of latch onto and frame the situation under a context of both, hey, look at this incompetent government, but also look at this authoritarian government keeping you under lock here, but there you're free and what have you, pointing to other parts of the country. So yeah, as to whether these dynamics have changed over the past year, the inoculation rates in Germany over the past year has been slow to catch up. It's definitely slow going. Just to give you an idea of perspective, Chancellor Angela Merkel herself received her second recommended booster shot just like last week or so, and 50% of the population became vaccinated just this past July. So it is slow going in relation to the both the political and social disposition of Germany compared to other countries who are not that well off, who are not that prosperous and politically stable. However, with the relaxed restrictions lately, the economy has shown signs of improvements, and consumer confidence is reflecting the fact. And because of that, the intensity of the conflict has shown signs of slowing down. It's not going away, but it has shown signs of slowing down. Excuse me. The biggest worry at the moment is the Delta variant of the coronavirus, just beginning this whole conflict cycle all over again through an increase in incidence rates. And again, this is another thing that's it's not unique to Germany. Everyone has this dire question in mind of whether society and the government itself can shoulder a second round of restrictive health and safety measures, whether the economy, won't just immediately collapse in the face of something like that, where people will choose ridiculous casualty rates over, not being stuck at home for another 6 months. It really, really a lot of tough questions if this whole thing starts over again. So that is the biggest worry at the moment, and because of that worry, the getting everyone vaccinated, as soon as possible is a real big priority. But yeah, that's basically an overview, a broad overview of the specifics we're going to talk about now. And my friends Tabitha, Jin, and Stephen will take care of that. And yeah.
One of the main root causes of the Germans' vaccine conflict is the mistrust between the public and the institution. Of course, this existence of mistrust did not come into the picture overnight, but has been developing probably since the beginning of the establishment of institutions. Since the end of World War II, there have been countless number of protests and demonstrations in Germany, and to highlight a few, the popular uprising of 17 June 1953, where millions of German Democratic Republic, also known as Eastern Germany, people demonstrated for improved living conditions, government legitimacy, and German unity. The student movement of the 1960s was a movement by German students pressuring the government to reappraise the Nazi past and sought society transformation. Last but not least is the Monday demonstration that took place on 4 September 1989, where thousands of East Germans participated in a peaceful demonstration which resulted in the fall of the Berlin Wall, which we are all familiar with, and ultimately led to the reunification of Germany. As Robert Blair et al. Highlighted in their study titled Public Health and Public Mistrust Survey Evidence from the Ebola virus disease epidemic in Liberia, trust in government has long been viewed as an important determinant of citizens' compliance, and we can see that in Germany, past experiences of mistrust has exacerbated the current anti-vaccine and anti-lockdown movement by the people. Another underlying root cause is the anti-Semitism and or neo-Nazism ideology that stems from the past government regime, which blurs the judgment skills of Germans. For example, during the plague outbreak of 1712 and 1713, the city of Hamburg in Germany forbid Jews from entering or leaving the city because they were accused of being carriers of the plague. Since then, any epidemics or epidemics has been associated with the Jews being the culprits of the spread of the disease. When cholera resurfaced in the city of Hamburg in the late 19th century, the local officials proposed to build public health regulations that angered the local Germans, but the bill was actually targeted to wipe out the Jews and the poor, as one German physician argued the cholera epidemic would remove the weaklings from society. The saddest part of the current COVID-19 pandemic for Germany is that a recent survey carried out by the World Jewish Congress organization identified a surprisingly high percentage of individuals holding anti-Jewish beliefs at 27%, and the researchers believe this number is growing due to the governmental management and response to COVID-19. One of the COVID-19 skeptic groups is QAnon, and this group has been identified as having connections to a far-right group known as the Nordkreuz, or Shadow Army, made of formal military officials and law enforcement. Since the pandemic was announced, the Nordkreuz has used the COVID-19 platform to spread its communist propaganda. Along with the anti-Semitism groups, anti-science groups have been on the rise, and one of the claims they're pursuing is since the vaccination was distributed, it has caused infertility, which the experts have discounted. While the anti-Jewish symbols do not appear as apparent as before, in fact, they appear in forms of coded languages that are typically used by populist parties attempting to advance their ideologies. The negative effects of the aforementioned root causes are polarization and increased violent protests and demonstrations. Regardless of state political association, far right, also known as National Democratic Party, neo-Nazi, founded in 1964, or far left, also referred to as Democratic Socialist Party, founded in 2007, anti-Jewish and anti-science, or QAnon. These groups have polarized with similar purposes, which are anti-vaccination and anti-lockdown restrictions. Recently, the German police had an increase in their engagements with protesters as the Chancellor Angela Merkel's administration was given more power by the parliament to fight the third wave of the pandemic. Far-right violent crimes involving immigrants have spiked by 10.6% since February of 2020, and in August of 2020, protesters stormed the steps of the Parliament building where some protesters were waving neo-Nazism symbolic flags. In addition, the left-wing violent crimes also increased in 2020, targeting police and security authorities. As the polarization in Germany intensifies, as Chancellor Merkel's administration struggles to find the right solution to vaccination acquisition and distribution, Germany is probably on a trajectory to become a weak and fragile state if the violent protests and demonstrations do not dissipate soon. As Germany is becoming a major migrant magnet for refugees from already weakened and fragile states, the United Nations published article on the medium and long-term implications of COVID-19 stated that aggravation of human rights can also fuel conflict during the pandemic, increase discrimination, gender-based violence, and disproportionate impact on women, as well as a rise in stigma and hate speech against migrants and foreigners. As we have seen in the past, Germany has no problems attempting to eliminate the inferior ethnicity. Like how Ashley Corcu and Rachel Kleinfeld from our class reading identified the United States divisions polarizing in a positive direction between the Republicans and the Democrats, Germany's divisions and polarization need to head in a positive direction instead of slowly returning to the Hitler period of governance.
Within the context of the keyline divisions that Jin covered, there are various parties within this conflict, to include the main parties of the German government and the German citizens. But of course, within both of those groups, there are various subgroups, all with varying interests, and they may be competing interests, some may be aligned. And then you also have external groups and organizations such as the European Commission. You have the organizations or companies that are producing the vaccines like AstraZeneca that are not directly involved, but have some indirect impact on the whole dynamic and therefore the conflict that is going on in Germany. So as far as the German government and the German citizens are concerned, since those are the main parties to the conflict, the German government has, when we talk about the German government, we're talking about the leadership, we're talking about the German police, right, that are directly clashing with anti-lockdown protesters, for example. And then going back to the leadership, you have varying and competing interests within government, and especially with the 2021 election going on in Germany, that's really changing and affecting the dynamic that is going within that leadership, those leadership positions in government, as well as how they're communicating their narratives to their constituencies, which are the German citizens. German citizens, on the other hand, if we take a look at the makeup of that group, again, also varied, but the longer it takes to vaccinate citizens, and, just a general view of the conflict, the longer it takes for them to get vaccinated, the longer it'll take for the economy to rebound from the dramatic slowdown caused by the pandemic. So as the pandemic rages on, the lockdowns tend to get extended, which prompts anti-lockdown activists to protest, which are also a subgroup within the German citizenry. Again, within those anti-lockdown activists, which is another group, there are many subgroups within that. So the anti-lockdown activists are composed of various actors such as Kurt Denken. You have anti-vaxxers, you have supporters of conspiracy theories within those activist groups. You have supporters of populist ideas, which Al covered. And so many of these groups have different interests from each other, but there is that overarching anti-lockdown interest that they all have, which align. And the difficulty in addressing all of these people's interests is what's really exacerbating a significant portion of this conflict. You have those external parties that I've discussed, like the European Commission, and they're involved really mainly because when it comes to procuring shots for member states, um, they are trying to stay away from a national approach and trying to stay in the approach of the union, so that you don't have member countries bidding on their own for vaccine supplies, risk tearing up political cohesion in the union, which could fuel nationalistic, populistic forces that so far have been kept at bay, to an extent, because you do have them protesting as well. Again, with such a complex makeup of these groups and subgroups within them, it's very difficult to say how a party defines themselves unless you really specify who within those groups you're talking about, and how they define the other, again, also depends on who you're specifying. But when it comes to the German government being a broad categorization of one of the parties, they define themselves as the ones that are governing the nation, and are looking to balance the tensions between having the economy recover, and also maintaining public health, which is one of the root causes to the conflict. And you'll see that in our tree. And then when it comes to the German citizens, they define themselves again in various ways. When it comes to anti-vaxxers, their interests are more in just not wanting to be vaccinated, again, which is causing delays in the lockdown. And then you have supporters of conspiracy theories who define themselves in that regard. You have the populists there, and then you have Kordenken. So again, all these various subgroups defining themselves and using their interest to define the other a certain way, which is, when I say the other, I'm really speaking about the German government. What do the different parties think about what the conflict is about? Again, within each party, with various interests and dynamics that are at play, it really depends on who we are specifying. For the German government, the conflict is about the balance of procuring vaccines to speed up the easing of lockdowns and set economic recovery back on course for Germany, while also securing a strong position for the upcoming election in 2021. For German citizens, anti-lockdown activists and protesters all having varying subgroups, the conflict is about many things. The more salient or prominent subgroups primarily want an end to the lockdowns, but also just want a general end to restrictions as well, such as mask wearing, social distancing, and group gathering restrictions. Tabitha, who will talk after me, is going to talk more about the strategies and tactics these varying parties use, and the power distributions among them.
When looking at the German vaccine conflict, there is a core problem of power of leadership within Germany. To understand this problem more, you have to first understand the relationship among the parties involved within the conflict itself. So under the approval of the European Union member states, the European Commission vaccine distribution plan was planned to avoid competition among countries within the alliance for vaccine quantities. So the European Commission creates deals for vaccine quantities, discussing the prices for such quantities with pharma companies such as BioNTech and Pfizer and AstraZeneca. Then the German government receives these planned doses as of late in shortage supplies, or the dates of receiving these vaccines have been delayed, to distribute them to clinics, hotspots within Germany, family doctors, and other institutions to distribute them to those who qualify for receiving the vaccine. The In addition to the distribution itself, the German government leadership, including Chancellor Merkel, introduces measures that governments have across the world, including social distancing, mask wearing, lockdowns, curfews, etc. German residents and activists either choose to abide these rules or not to abide these rules. And for activists and right-wing populists who do not abide by them, they lash out against the government in violent and nonviolent protests. Lastly, one additional party within this conflict is undocumented migrants within Germany. And for these populations, there are some regions within the country that are choosing to vaccinate these refugee populations. But in order to do so, proof of habitual residence, or in the case of people who cannot cover the cost of the vaccine itself, must provide coverage of insurance in doctors' offices to be given the vaccine. So in addition to the relationship among the parties, there is also the problem of looking at how power is distributed among these parties to understand this core problem of power of leadership. So the federal government and leadership such as Chancellor Merkel hold the power to impose stricter restrictions and may be granted special powers if bills are passed in upper courts. This also leads to allowing the European Commission to have the power to negotiate for greater deals for vaccine doses with pharma companies such as BioNTech, Pfizer, and AstraZeneca. But ultimately, the European Commission also has larger powers for external trade and competition among those who are looking to buy vaccine quantities. Anti-lockdown activists, anti-vaxxers, and extremist groups like Kurderker have the power to create grassroots-like momentum regarding COVID-19 measures put in place and ultimately disagree with German democracy. They also have the power to promote radicalization, as protests often lead to physical violence against police officers and those who counter the protests that are going on. This leads to effects of radicalization, lack of adherence to social distancing measures, and mask wearing. And so these are some tactics that parties have pursued in the course of this contact regarding not wearing masks, social distancing measures, and overwhelming police by not abiding by court order gathering rules. Other strategies include priority lists for those to get vaccinated, extending the length of time between dose 1 and 2 because of supply shortages, and putting radical and violent groups under government surveillance to monitor how they're reacting to situations outside of violent and nonviolent protests.